They scratched at my back door, rib cages showing through filthy fur, too scared to meow. So I fed them. A little tuna, a little kindness. Then came the letter, 300 in fines for unauthorized animal feeding, signed by the same woman who left her own dog howling behind a locked fence for days without food. They called her HOA president, but I came to know her by another name. And when animal control showed up, she found out who'd been watching her all along and why I never stopped feeding those cats. Like stories of quiet justice? Tap that like button and subscribe for more tales that turn the tables. They showed up one by one, like shadows too light to be seen until they moved. The first came after a storm, limping along the edge of my fence with fur clumped like dead grass, and eyes full of something I didn't recognize until much later. Hunger, yes, but more than that, suspicion carved deep by hands that never fed with kindness. I left out a bowl of tuna the next morning, half expecting it to sit untouched, but by sundown it was licked clean, and the bowl nudged a few inches from where I'd left it. 2 days later, there were 3 cats. They didn't meow. They waited. One perched on the edge of my porch, watching like I was a trick she'd seen before. Another crouched low in the flower bed, too thin to hide well, but still trying. I started buying cat food. Not the fancy kind, just enough to soften their bones and fill their bellies. It felt like something small I could do in a world that often punished small kindness. Each time I stepped outside, I moved slow, spoke soft, crouched so I wouldn't tower like whatever had hurt them. Some twitched at the sound of the bag rustling. One hissed. But they ate, and I kept feeding. There was no grand plan behind it. No sign posted, no mission announced. I didn't take pictures or name them. It was just an understanding. They came for food and quiet, and I gave what I had. A neighbor waved at me once, looked down at the bowls, then looked away. I could tell she didn't approve, but she didn't say anything. That silence felt heavier than words. I knew it wouldn't stay simple. Nothing good ever does around here. But I figured, so long as they kept coming, I'd keep filling the bowls. You don't survive long in this world by being kind. But you don't stay human without it, either. The envelope was taped crooked to my door, corners flapping in the breeze like it couldn't wait to be noticed. I peeled it off and stood there in my slippers, reading the bold print of an official-looking letter that started with, "Notice of violation." It went on about community guidelines and unauthorized feeding of feral animals, then ended with a fine of $150 and a deadline to remove all food sources immediately. There wasn't a signature, just a name typed in stiff block letters. Denise Carlton, HOA president. I sat on my porch with the letter in my lap, the afternoon sun already making the ink sweat. Across the street, her red SUV was parked neatly in the driveway, not a leaf out of place on her manicured lawn. I knew of her, the way everyone in this neighborhood did. The woman who sent out reminder emails about trash bin placement and threatened citations for faded paint on mailbox posts. She liked control, and now apparently that extended to hungry cats. That evening, when the cats returned, I fed them anyway. I watched them eat slowly, pausing with every sound, their shoulders stiff with leftover fear. It was hard to imagine anyone seeing this and calling it a problem. The next morning, I knocked on my neighbor Karen's door. Her name wasn't really Karen, but the nickname had stuck after she complained to the board about a Halloween skeleton someone left out past November. She opened the door, looked at me, and sighed. "You too," she said. She showed me her letter. Same fine, same warning. Hers was for a bird feeder hanging under her awning. "They're calling it unauthorized wildlife encouragement," she muttered. "What does that even mean?" I didn't have an answer, but when I walked back home and found a little orange kitten curled under my porch chair, eyes closed tight and ribs showing through her fur, I folded the letter and slid it into a drawer. Let them come. Some things are worth more than compliance. She showed up while I was watering the hydrangeas, walking like she owned every square foot of pavement she passed. Her heels clicked against the sidewalk even though we lived in a neighborhood where most folks wore sneakers or gardening clogs. She had on a powder blue blouse tucked into crisp slacks, not a wrinkle in sight, and sunglasses that made her eyes unreadable. She paused at the edge of my lawn, arms folded neatly like I'd been summoned to her office. "I assume you got the notice," she said. I turned the hose off and nodded, water dripping from the end in a quiet rhythm. "It's nothing personal," she added, But feeding stray animals encourages them to linger, and that creates problems. Fleas, noise, sanitation issues. Her voice had a smooth, almost pleasant tone, like she was reading from a script meant to sound reasonable. But behind the polish, I caught the familiar edge. Control doesn't always come loud. Sometimes it wears lipstick and a smile and pretends it's protecting you. While she spoke, her dog barked from behind the tall fence of her backyard. The sound was hoarse, drawn out, like it had been going on for hours. I glanced toward it, and so did she, with a flicker of annoyance rather than concern. "Princess has separation anxiety," she explained. "Can't be helped. I'm out most weekends and she just gets a little dramatic." The barking didn't stop. It clawed at the silence between us. She turned back to me, smile resetting. "I'd appreciate your cooperation. The HOA takes these matters seriously." I watched her walk away, her perfume lingering in the air longer than her presence. It was hard not to see the irony in it all. She spoke of sanitation, while her own dog screamed from a corner no one else could see. She warned of pests while leaving a living thing to pace in circles without food or company for days at a time. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply picked the hose back up, watered the last row of flowers, and waited for the cats to return. Some people protect what they love. Others punish what they fear. You can tell the difference by who they feed. The fines kept coming, not just for me, but for others. A man 2 streets over was cited for having a flag on his porch that wasn't HOA approved. An older couple was warned for wind chimes that exceeded acceptable noise levels. One woman I met at the community mailbox said she got a notice because her flower pots were too colorful. She whispered the word colorful like it was something to be ashamed of. What tied us together wasn't just the harassment. It was the quiet way it happened, always on paper, never face to face unless she wanted to make a point. Denise's letters weren't just fines, they were signals. You were either with the order she believed in, or you were a threat to it. The cats still came, more of them now. I started leaving food in a covered bin and placing clean bowls just after dusk. I saw new faces among Theman with a torn ear, another missing fur across his side, like he'd scraped against something hard and fast. They were silent, respectful of the peace, and yet the porch felt more alive when they were there than it ever did without them. I set up a small trail camera under the eaves, mostly to check for raccoons. What I caught instead made my stomach twist. It was Denise. Sometime after midnight, she crept up the driveway, broom in hand. She swung at the bowls, scattering food, then chased the cats into the bushes, her face tight with something darker than annoyance. She muttered things I couldn't quite make out. One of the cats bolted across the yard and ran straight into the side of my shed with a sickening thud before vanishing into the darkness. I played the footage twice, then turned the camera off and sat in silence. A neighbor texted me the next day. They'd found one of the cats curled up under their deck with a limp in its back leg. I gave him some chicken. Hope that's okay. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked out the window where one small kitten was curled on the mat, blinking slowly in the morning light. I realized then that this wasn't about cats or fines or rules. It was about who gets to exist quietly, and who someone like her thinks should disappear. The next fine was folded and shoved into my mailbox without an envelope. $300, bold red ink, stamped with the HOA seal, like it meant something sacred. This time the wording was sharper. Failure to comply with community directives regarding feral animal feeding. Continued violations may result in legal action. My name wasn't even typed right. They had added an extra letter, like I didn't matter enough to spell correctly. That same day, I heard her dog again. Longer this time. Hours. I sat by the window, sipping tea gone cold, listening to that desperate bark echo across her yard. No one came. No one fed her. That sound wasn't dramatic, as Denise once claimed. It was hunger. I walked the block, casual, unhurried, and stopped by the fence when no one was looking. The water bowl was dry. I couldn't see any food at all. Just a dog pacing in tight, anxious circles, ribcage starting to show. She didn't bark when she saw me. She just looked. Back home, I opened a drawer and pulled out a cheap spiral notebook. I began to write dates, times, weather conditions, what I heard, what I saw. I printed photos from the trail camera. I recorded audio with my phone and labeled each file, A neighbor across the street added her own observations. She leaves on Fridays, comes back Sunday night. I've never seen anyone else go inside. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I needed to be sure. That weekend, Denise left her sprinklers on overnight. The water shot out across the lawn and splattered my porch in thin sheets. It soaked the feeding station, scattered the dry food, and left the bowls filled with cold, muddy runoff. The next morning, the cats came wet and shivering, fur heavy and sticking to their ribs. I found a kitten near the azaleas. She was too small to survive a chill like that. I scooped her up with a towel, but it was already too late. Her body was light and still, like she had let go the moment it stopped hurting. I named her June, just to give her something. That night, I added one more page to the notebook. Then I closed it and left it on the table. I had seen enough, and someone, somewhere, was going to hear about it. The day after I buried June, I stood on my porch and stared at the spot where I used to leave the bowls. The ground was still damp, and the air held that sour smell left behind when clean water mixes with dirty things. I didn't bother putting the feeding station back up. I just set a bowl of kibble beside the porch step and waited to see who would come. They came slower than usual, one at a time. Their eyes scanned every movement, every sound. One limped, another kept low to the ground, ears flat against its head. They were learning that kindness had a cost. I thought maybe Denise would feel some sort of guilt. Maybe she'd look out her window and see what she'd done, and feel something shift in her chest. But later that afternoon, I saw her outside clipping her hedges with one hand while speaking into her phone with the other. She laughed at something, not once looking over at the corner of my yard. That was when I knew she wasn't just enforcing rules. She wanted to punish. She didn't care if it hurt animals, or neighbors, or her own dog howling through the fence. She cared about control. And when people stopped fearing her, she made sure they paid for it. I opened the notebook that night and flipped through every page. I added the photo of June's small grave marked with a smooth river stone. Then I sat on the couch with my phone in my lap, thumb hovering over the number I had looked up earlier that week. I didn't call yet. Not that night. Instead, I pulled out one last clean towel, poured a cup of warm milk into a shallow dish, and left both on the back step. That evening, one of the cats came close enough to touch. She brushed against my ankle, lean but no longer trembling, and I whispered something I didn't know I needed to say. You're safe now, at least for tonight. But tomorrow, I was going to make sure someone held her accountable, for every soaked paw, for every scared cry, for June. It took me 3 tries to dial the number. My hands weren't shaking, but something deeper inside me was. I had spoken up before in smaller ways. Letters to the board, quiet comments at meetings, polite conversations that never went anywhere. But this felt different. This was a line I couldn't uncross once I stepped over it. The voice on the other end was calm. A woman, probably younger than me, who listened without interrupting as I laid it all out. The recordings, the trail cam photos, the barking that didn't stop, the soaked feeding area, and the kitten that didn't survive it. I told her about the schedule, the weekends away, the empty water bowls and the dry kibble. I tried not to sound angry. I didn't want revenge. I wanted it to stop. She asked me for my name. I gave it. I told her I didn't want to stay anonymous. If this was going to mean something, I needed to stand behind it. We'll send someone out, she said. You did the right thing. I hung up and stared at the phone in my lap. The cats hadn't come yet. The porch was quiet. Even Princess next door had gone silent. Maybe she sensed something shifting too. I didn't feel brave. I felt tired. But beneath that, there was something else I hadn't felt in a long time. Resolved. All that time, Denise spent chasing the shadows in her yard. She never thought someone might be watching her. Not out of spite, but out of duty to the creatures too small to speak for themselves. I wasn't trying to win anything. I just couldn't keep pretending it was someone else's problem. Tomorrow, the door would knock somewhere else, and for once, it wouldn't be mine. They came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 white vans marked with county decals pulling into the neighborhood just after lunch. I was sitting on the porch with a paperback in my lap, pretending to read, but my eyes never left the street. The air was still. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. 2 officers stepped out, one in uniform, the other in plain clothes with a clipboard. They walked up Denise's driveway like they'd done it 100 times before. Calm. Direct. No hurry. No hesitation. They rang the bell, and I watched her open the door in a sleeveless blouse and spotless smile. I couldn't hear what they said, but I saw how her body stiffened, saw the way her mouth opened in confusion before snapping shut. She folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe like she might close it if she just held her ground long enough. Then one of the officers gestured toward the backyard. Her hand twitched, her head shook, but eventually, she moved. The plainclothes officer stayed at the front, flipping through the clipboard, jotting notes while neighbors peeked out from behind curtains. One couple stepped outside, pretending to check their mailbox, but their eyes were fixed on the unfolding scene. 10 minutes passed, then 20. When the officers reappeared, one was holding something wrapped in a faded pink towel. It was a small dog, limp but breathing. Princess. She looked lighter than the last time I had seen her, too quiet for a creature that usually never stopped barking. They didn't say anything to Denise when they passed her on the lawn, just walked to the van with purpose and care. She followed them for a few steps, hands moving as she tried to explain something, voice raised just enough for me to hear the words, misunderstanding, and targeted. Neither officer looked back. When the van doors closed and the engine started, the plainclothes one turned to her and said something short, clipped, final. She didn't answer, just stood there in the middle of her perfect lawn, blinking like the sun had just turned its back on her. The vans didn't leave right away. A second unit pulled up not long after the first, this one carrying more officers and 2 animal carriers already stacked in the back. Denise stood off to the side now, arms crossed tight, her voice low and urgent as she spoke into her phone. I watched her pace in slow circles, like she didn't know whether to argue or retreat. 2 officers entered through her side gate. They came out with the first crate a few minutes later. Inside was a second dog, smaller than Princess, its fur matted into thick clumps and eyes dulled by whatever it had lived through behind that fence. It didn't bark, it didn't struggle. It just lay there, pressed into the corner of the carrier like it had forgotten what open space felt like. From my porch, I saw the clipboard officer nod once, then make a call of his own. Within the hour, a man in city uniform pulled up in a utility truck and started snapping photos of the property bowls with green-tinted water, waste scattered in corners, the flimsy shelter that barely covered the dog run. Denise tried to intercept him, pointing toward the sky, toward the house, toward me once or twice, but the man ignored her and kept working. When the officers emerged with a final crate, the stench hit even from where I sat. One of them pulled his shirt over his nose. The other muttered something I couldn't catch. They didn't use the word arrest, but I could see in Denise's face she had crossed into new territory. Her hands shook as she signed the paperwork. Her phone call ended without satisfaction. She didn't yell, not really, just stood there surrounded by neat hedges and flower beds, completely undone by the thing she had always claimed to protect rules. One officer walked past her, looked toward my porch, and gave a nod that was neither friendly nor forced, just a kind of recognition. I nodded back. Sometimes justice doesn't knock loud. Sometimes it arrives in a van and leaves with silence trailing behind. They called the emergency meeting 2 days later. Fold-out chairs filled the community center, most of them occupied by neighbors I had only ever waved to in passing. The ones who usually stayed quiet now looked up when someone entered, their faces drawn tight with something close to anticipation. Denise didn't show. The vice president, a thin man with a stiff collar and a nervous laugh, stood at the front of the room beside a small projector screen. He cleared his throat and began with the usual phrases. "We are aware of the recent events, and we appreciate your patience during this time." But he wasn't there to smooth things over. His voice faltered once, then steadied. "The board has voted to place President Carlton on administrative leave pending investigation. Formal charges have been filed by county officials for animal neglect." The room stayed quiet for a beat longer than normal. Then someone clapped. It wasn't loud, just a single pair of hands, but it spread, soft, hesitant, then building. Not a celebration, more like a long exhale. One neighbor stood and spoke about her fines for having native plants in her yard. Another talked about the time her kids were threatened with suspension from the community pool because they used a squirt gun. More stories followed. They didn't shout. They didn't accuse. They simply spoke. I didn't stand. I just listened. It struck me how long people had been holding their breath, how many letters they had folded in half and thrown away, how many small injustices they had decided to swallow, thinking it would keep the peace. That night, as the meeting ended, I walked out under the porch light with no papers in hand. Just a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in months. The kind that means something wrong has been named. And maybe now, something right can begin. A week later, the letter came in a plain white envelope, no HOA stamp in sight, just my name, spelled correctly this time, and a return address from the county. I opened it at the kitchen table with the cats lounging on the windowsill nearby, sunlight stretching across their backs. It was short, a formal notice confirming that Denise Carlton had been charged with multiple counts of animal neglect. The animals removed from her property were now in the care of the local shelter and receiving treatment. An official had reviewed the complaints filed against me and determined that no further action would be taken. The fines were voided. My record was clear. At the bottom was a line that stuck with me. Thank you for your concern and for doing the right thing. I folded the letter slowly, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the same drawer where the first fine had gone. That drawer still held the spiral notebook, the photos, the recordings. But now, it also held something that felt like closure. The neighborhood felt different, not louder or more friendly, but less heavy somehow. I passed neighbors who nodded instead of looking away. A few even stopped to chat. The air felt easier to breathe. I looked out at the porch where the bowls sat clean and full. The cats were waiting. I stepped outside and smiled. This time, there would be no letters, only company. And peace. The porch looks different now. Not just because I cleared space for the feeding station, or because a neighbor helped me build a little shelter out of wood scraps and shingles. It's in the way the light feels when it touches the steps. The way the cats walk now, not crouched or darting, but steady, almost curious. There are fewer of them than before. A few found homes with people who used to pretend they didn't see them. One went to a woman 2 doors down who said she never thought of herself as a cat person, then bought a bed that takes up half her guest room. The ones who stayed come at dusk and dawn, pausing on the porch rail to stretch or blink at me like they've known me longer than I've known myself. Sometimes I sit out there with a cup of coffee, just listening. The sound of paws on the wood, the low hum of insects, a far-off lawnmower, no barking, no shouting, only the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty. One afternoon, the same officer who carried Princess in that towel stopped by. He didn't come for business. He just saw me out front and waved, told me the dogs were doing better, said one had already been adopted. He looked at the cats and smiled. Thanks for not turning away, he said. I nodded but didn't say anything, just reached down to fill another bowl. That was thanks enough. She came one evening just as the sky turned the color of old bruises, a black and white cat with a crooked tail and wide amber eyes. She stood at the edge of the porch like she wasn't sure if she was welcome, but hunger pulled her forward step by cautious step. I set the bowl down and waited. She sniffed it, glanced up at me once, then ate like she hadn't tasted real food in days. When she finished, she didn't run. She sat by my foot and began to clean her paw, like this was already her place too. I named her June, not because she reminded me of the one I buried, but because she made it through. She comes every evening now, the last to arrive, the last to leave. Sometimes she falls asleep in the small patch of sunlight on the porch boards, belly full, eyes half closed. I don't pet her. I don't need to. She's not here for that. She's here for the quiet, the kind that holds space for healing without asking for anything in return. I think about how it started, with one frightened kitten and a letter meant to silence me. I think about what it means to stay soft when the world says be hard, what it means to feed the thing no one else will touch. The porch is still. The bowls are full. June lifts her head and lets out one quiet meow. It sounds like home.